Hi there. Good evening, everyone. It is Thursday evening, and I am actually cooking in a vintage Wagner aluminum Dutch oven. You can see from the sawtooth handle ridge underneath here that this is actually a Wagner pot. So as I mentioned, I am making some pasta here. This, of course, is going to be the start of mac and cheese. So, of course, if you want macaroni and cheese, you've got to have, well, macaroni. When it comes to mac and cheese, I especially like using this kind of macaroni. It's got a fancy name for it, and I'm not sure if that's real or not. Cavatappi. This is great stuff because you can see the ridges on the pasta, as well as it having a lot of surface space. So this is obviously meant really great for grabbing the cheese and holding on to the cheese sauce. So much as I love elbow macaroni, when I find this stuff, this is really what really I think probably the best you can have for mac and cheese. Let's take out a little bit here. Do a nice little close-up of that. We do have some cheese ready for it. I've got myself some cheddar and some Munster. Two very good melting cheeses that should give this a very satisfying taste. In fact, if you have never made homemade mac and cheese, this would be a nice project to do, especially with your kids. And furthermore, your kids will be much more likely to eat it if they have actually participated in making it. Nonetheless, I'd say it's probably time to drain the pasta. Lovely dollar store gloves here. Guess what we have here, folks? We have ourselves none other than a gate-marked cast iron skillet. This is probably a number 9 size skillet. It's maybe about 10 to 11 inches in diameter. And this thing, well, who knows, could very well date to the late 1800s, or possibly even a little earlier than that. Okay, yeah, this, of course, is actually fairly well known on the cast iron cooking group. Especially because we've got a lot of these unknown, what they call fancy handled pans. It's got a nice fancy handle to it. Again, the maker of these pans is unknown. In fact, they were likely made by several different makers. The fancy handle ones may come from the same manufacturer. However, the theory among collectors is that these pans here were actually disposable. They were throwaway items. The idea back in those days was that you would buy yourself a cast iron cooking stove, and along with the stove, they would throw in a complimentary set of cast iron cookware. You'd get yourself a pan, probably a smaller pan. You get a stock pot. That's also known as those bulge kettles. You would also get maybe a griddle, or who knows. A lot of those pans, again, were gate marked because they really didn't care too much about what the bottom looked like, since they were throwaways. Sometimes they were marked with the letters A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, just so that you could identify and have all of the pieces of the set. You know, the griddle, the pan would be A, the griddle would be B, the sauce pot would be C, and so on. Funny thing is, even though this was meant to be a throwaway item, who knows what happened to the stove over the course of time. The stove has long since been lost, and yet this particular pan from that set still remains, and it's here in my kitchen being used. But let's get down to some actual cooking. How about that? As the Cooking Cajun says, first you gotta make a roux. In this case, our measurements are fairly exact. As I made mac and cheese and did my research into it, I discovered that there actually is something of a scientific method here to making the roux for mac and cheese. I know the easy rule, of course, is you have equal amounts of flour and fat, or grease, or butter. And that's part of it. The other part, of course, is the cheese, in that if your roux is too thick, the cheese will turn into one huge solid lump, and you'll have yourself this big mass of chewy cheese that is probably similar to something from the Blob. It still tastes good, but it's impossible to make a good mac and cheese with that. That's why I'm specifically using only half a stick of butter. Basically, you're going to get about 1/4 cup of roux here. That's a quarter cup of butter and 1/4 cup of flour coming up. Because the rule for mac and cheese is that the amount of milk should be about 8 times the amount of the roux. So with simple math, we've got 1/4 cup here of roux. 8 times that is 2 cups of milk, which is what we'll be using. Hope you heard that over the scraping. Another thing about this gate-marked pan, it is warped. It is a spinner. Over time it was abused and probably overheated, and as a result it became warped on the bottom. But as you can see, it is still just fine for cooking. So if you come across a pan that is a slight spinner, yes, you can still use it. You just have to consider that there will be hot spots. This center part here is probably a fair amount hotter than the edges here, especially since this is a large pan, larger than the burner it's sitting on. In fact, if you look at it, you can see the bubbles are more in the center and not so much around the edges, which is why I want to keep this thing going. Another thing they say about Cajun, you do not stop when making the roux. May not want to stop, but it's time to continue. And add some of our milk. So I've got to get this going, and I hope I haven't made it too thick. Of course, it's only just started at this point. Alright. So this pan is anywhere from about 120 to 140 years old or so, and yet it's still cooking as good as the day it was cast. Well, maybe not, because this is actually slightly warped at this point. It's actually a spinner. I came across this pan at the Brimfield Antique Show, and I paid a total of $25 for this and a lid to go with it. The guy who sold it to me said most of the $25 was for the lid, because lids, of course, are more valuable, especially since the lid that came with this was a Griswold lid. Now, this is not a Griswold pan, so it was a mismatched set. I'm believing the guy thought I was paying basically for the lid and taking this off of his hands. Anyway, this is getting nice and steaming hot at this point, and we've got a nice sauce coming up, which means it's time to add the cheese. And from here, it's really no more than stirring until it melts, at which point we add a couple of spices, but not many, because after all, the cheese is delicious enough on its own. The other nice thing about this skillet here, as I mentioned, is I found it at Brimfield. And after I took it home, I discovered, sadly, that this cast iron skillet had not one, but two cracks. One of them quite large, in fact. One was here and one was, I think, on the other side, near the handle here. And I was, of course, very disappointed. But of course, again, especially when buying vintage cast iron, well, buyer beware. Nonetheless, I felt like I did not want to abandon this. I mean, I wanted to use this. I wanted to keep this. So I actually found a person or a contractor in my area who welded cast iron. And unlike some auto body shops, this guy here was a real professional. It did take a couple of weeks for him to fit it into his schedule, yes, but he did get around to doing it. And the resulting job was one of the best, I guess, cast iron welding jobs I've ever seen. After it was seasoned over, you could barely see it at all. This was a few years ago, and this thing has worked just fine ever since. It is possible to weld cast iron, but as anyone who's done so will tell you, it can be tough. And look at this, by the way. This is definitely melting. We are getting ourselves a real cheese sauce here. The power of cheese. At this point, the cheese is just about ready, I'd say. Which means we get to spice it up a little bit. Looks like we're going to have to sprinkle in a little kosher salt. The pepper. Get to throw in just a little mustard, dry mustard. The old smoked paprika. Be careful here, that's probably enough. I blame Alton Brown for introducing me to smoked paprika. Ever since he described it, I went out and tried it for myself, and now I'm hooked. Damn you, Alton Brown. So at this point, I think it's ready for the pasta. Plop. Start there. May not be the same as Jeff Rogers' mac and cheese, but I'm certainly not complaining. It does take a little bit less effort than his. Sorry, Jeff. Which means now from here, we get to put on a topping. And of course, if you're going to do a topping of mac and cheese, well, there are many things you can top it with, yes, but probably one of the most popular is Ritz crackers, which I took the time to crush even before I opened up the package. There you go. This is one thing people generally don't do with the box stuff. It seems like, you know, pretty much you just heat it up on the stove, mix in the cheese, powder, and milk, and then just chow down from there. In which case, of course, you don't know what you're missing if you don't go the extra step and bake it. Here I thought I was getting Parmesan, ended up with Romano. Oh gee, what a shame. I guess we'll just have to top this with 100% Romano cheese. There we go. Think that's enough cheese, folks? We are about to put this in the oven. So, it's going to take, I don't know, 20 minutes to half an hour or so. We are, of course, baking this at about 400 degrees. So from there, it will be done. Now this is a mac and cheese.
That's the part I want.
Kind of like the cheese pagao.
Yeah. Oh.
Oh yeah.
Yep. There you go.
Oh yeah. And I hope you had fun watching this. I had a lot of fun, and I hope you did. And everybody, please keep safe. It's, you know, things are pretty tough right now, so I did this, I guess, as well to try to cheer everybody up a little bit, as well as myself. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Have yourself a good evening, folks. Keep on cooking.